Last week, we began talking about the idea of change. We said that a lot of us don't react well to change, and that when we do deal with change, we're normally dealing with a change outside of us. But we said that Jesus is inviting us into a new way. We said that change on the outside is one thing, but change on the inside is what matters most. And a change happening outside of us can be an invitation to examine what kind of change needs to happen inside of us. Now, this kind of reflection is easier said than done, because often we find ourselves consumed with managing the change around us. Sometimes that change happens because of loss, death, hurt, or pain. And dealing with this kind of change seems nearly impossible. If there was ever a recent year that highlighted change, it was 2020. I bet none of us will ever forget the year 2020, particularly that spring. Life was relatively normal, but in a matter of weeks, even days, everything changed. We were suddenly in a worldwide pandemic. And because so much was unknown about the virus, the whole world went into lockdown. Previously unknown concepts like shelter in place and social distancing became part of our vocabulary and our lives. Many people began to work from home. We didn't go anywhere. We stopped shaking hands or even hugging people. We homeschooled our kids, and we stocked up on toilet paper, like a lot of toilet paper. And just like that, we knew things would never be the same. In ways large and small, each of us lost something. A sense of normalcy, a sense of security, maybe even a loved one. In a very real way, for most of us, that season will always represent the loss of something. Sometimes with change comes pain. Some of us have experienced pain recently on a much more personal level. We've experienced the death of a relationship or the physical death of a loved one. Because of that loss, we've experienced different stages of grief, like denial or anger. We thought it couldn't be happening. The diagnosis had to be wrong. The relationship could still be saved. Our kids weren't in as bad a spot as we imagined. We make up all kinds of reasons and excuses for why this loss or hurt or pain isn't real, that we can be spared from it or that we can avoid it altogether. We search for logic in the midst of loss for two main reasons. First, we deny the reality of the pain and loss because it's so big, and we know life will never be the same if it's real. And that's terrifying. So denial enables us to cope. And second, big pain brings up some big questions about God, about faith, about what it all means. It makes us wonder if God is actually good, which is a scary question to even ask. Maybe even more scary, we wonder if we did something to deserve what's happening. Are bad things happening because we did something bad? Pain is real. Because of that, it's vital that we understand how to best approach these seasons. And there's no better time to address this universal problem of pain than during the season of Easter. In fact, the Easter story, while ultimately triumphant, holds a lot of pain and suffering. Even Jesus, who was clear on his mission and purpose, struggled with a desire to avoid pain. As the day of his death grew closer, Jesus desperately prayed to God, asking if there was any way around what was on the horizon. So let's look at how Jesus himself reconciled his experience with what he knew to be true about God. With that in mind, we're looking at some passages from the book of Philippians, which was actually written many years after the events of Easter. But before we get into passages, here's some background to this book. Philippians is actually a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Philippi, a major Greek city at the time. A majority of the New Testament is comprised of letters written by Paul to churches and fellow people in ministry. And each letter he wrote has a different tone and topic based on the audience and time period. We may read his letters back to back in one sitting, but it's important to remember the context of these letters. Paul was a real person on one side of the conversation, writing to real people on the other side of the conversation. When we keep that in mind, it brings what we read to life in a different sort of way. To add even more context to these verses, Paul was writing to the Philippian church while in prison. He was awaiting sentencing and anticipating the possibility of death. So Paul wrote about Jesus and pain and suffering, all while he himself was in the middle of an extremely trying time. And the reason Paul was in jail and facing death? For preaching the good news about Jesus. So it would be understandable if Paul wasn't in the best of moods. It would be understandable if Paul was confused about receiving bad for doing good. And it would definitely be understandable if Paul felt abandoned by God. Instead, what do we find in this letter written from prison? Well, one constant theme of Philippians is joy, which seems weird. Given the circumstances of his life, given where his faith had landed him, how could Paul even consider writing about joy? Paul was experiencing pain and hurt and loss firsthand, a change of plans, a change in expectations for how his life would unfold. And yet, he faced it head on. He didn't resist it. He didn't deny it. He accepted it. How could he do that? It's the same question we may ask ourselves. How can we possibly find joy in the midst of pain? The answer to that question is found in the 2nd chapter of Philippians. It begins like this: "Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross." The very first thing Paul pointed out was that Jesus is God, meaning they are the same. The same God who created the world, the same God who breathed life into humanity, the same God who had performed miracles and wonders, this same God was this 30-something rabbi from the Middle East. They were one and the same. But Paul went on to write that even so, Jesus didn't act as if he was deserving of praise or worship or service. Paul wrote that Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to use to his advantage. In fact, Jesus did the exact opposite. Paul wrote that Jesus humbled himself and was obedient even to death. Here's what that means. Jesus didn't see pain or hurt or loss or even death as something to be avoided at all costs. Even more amazing, he didn't see experiencing pain or hurt or death as a reflection of how his Father felt about him. Pain wasn't a punishment. It wasn't karma. It didn't happen because God had accidentally or callously let things go terribly wrong. No, Jesus saw pain as something he could endure, something he could even embrace. Because, as Paul went on to write, "For God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases him." In other words, Jesus faced pain head on. He faced loss head on. He faced the cross head on because he knew his Father's story was bigger than what he could see. He knew that his Father wasn't absent. He was present. He knew that his Father wasn't silent. He was working. And because of that, because he knew that his Father was wise and strong and caring, Jesus could endure the most terrible of circumstances. I don't think it's an accident that these verses that describe the nature of Jesus and the way he faced pain made it into what many consider to be one of the earliest hymns of the early church. Because at the foundation of the faith was this idea: if God's own Son was not spared from hurt and pain and death, then we won't be either. And since the Father loves his Son with an everlasting love and still allowed him to experience what he did, then we can't expect to be exempt from it either. Because of Jesus and what he experienced, we can know that life's biggest challenges aren't a reflection of God's feelings towards us. Challenges and pain were a part of Jesus' life, and they will be a part of ours as well. But more than that, Jesus faced those realities with courage. We can do the same. We can see pain not as something to avoid or something we're being punished with, but as an opportunity to trust the bigger story, the bigger purpose of a great God. And we can face those things knowing we aren't alone. Jesus walked the road before us and faced the worst life has to offer. Now, when we're faced with our own difficulties, we can do like Jesus did. We can trust. Pain is an invitation to trust how God is working in a bigger story. So, considering all of this, how can we view and approach the pain in our lives? First, we stop resisting it. Jesus' approach to his own death and pain was so amazing that it became part of the way early Christians talked about his life. His attitude toward pain and loss was pivotal to the way they understood who he is and how he acted. Jesus set the example. We too can stop fighting it and instead look at Jesus and learn from his example. Now, that doesn't make it easy and it doesn't make it less painful, but it means we're capable of getting through the worst that life and death have to offer. Second, we can understand that loss, that death in all forms, is a part of life. Still, God is working, even in loss. Hurt is not an indication that God is left. God is always present with us. Pain doesn't mean God is gone. God is always active. He doesn't leave the story. And knowing that, we can face whatever is before us with the same attitude as Jesus. Practically speaking, we can ask ourselves, what is a loss or a death we've been resisting, that we've been fighting? What is a change we've been hesitant to accept out of fear? What is a loss that we need to believe God is working in, even though it's painful? What is a hurt we can face head on with the same attitude of Jesus, believing God is with us in it? Is it a relationship, a habit, a toxic friendship, a health diagnosis we've been living in denial about, leaving one phase of life and moving to another? What needs to be acknowledged, accepted? This week, think about a difficult change that has affected the way you see God or see your life. Then reimagine the story. Imagine not seeing the pain from the change as a punishment or an abandonment or something to resist. Instead, imagine this pain as an invitation to see Jesus and look for God working in the place you least expect it. Jesus faced the worst life had to offer, and because of him, we can do the same.